Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I wanted to talk about Twan's House of Doors, longlisted for the Booker in 2023. And as kind of with the rest of my Booker solo reviews and just sort of general solo reviews, typical rules apply in that I'll be going into spoilers later, but I'll sort of signpost when that's about to come up. But for the first part, the relatively spoiler-free part, all of that will be limited to things that you would find out from reading the synopsis of the book. So all good. And so let's get started in talking a bit about this book itself. So Twan is no stranger to the Booker longlist. He has been longlisted every time he has released, well, for all three of his books so far. And House of Doors is the third in that. He's done very, very well as an author in that regard. And I think this book is quite an interesting one in many, many ways. And I really greatly enjoyed it. I loved his last book, The Garden of Evening Mists. And so I was very, very excited for this. And it's taken me a little bit of time to come around to reviewing this book, partly because I wanted to get my own thoughts in order, and also partly because I wanted to read the short story that this book is sort of based off, or kind of uses as its starting point, which is the Casuarina tree by W. Somerset Maugham, and particularly the story The Letter. Now, in the short story The Letter, as a bit of a background, Maugham writes about the whole of this collection of short stories is about characters who live in Singapore and Malaysia and kind of nearby areas, and particularly during the sort of colonial times. This is also a time where Somerset Maugham himself would have been over in the area, which is sort of referenced in House of Doors. But the short story of The Letter talks about somebody who is up basically in the courts for having killed a man. And this woman, this sort of white woman from the UK who is over in the area, the Malay Strait, as it keeps on being referred to throughout this book. She is over in Malaysia and Singapore and the sort of that area as part of colonialism, essentially. She is incredibly wealthy and well off, as are many of the white British people around in the area, whereas the people who support her, you know, in terms of, I say support, the people who are servants and whatever else are not particularly well supported or funded in quite the same way. And this is a sort of a starting point because this is so instrumental to the whole of the House of Doors. But in this short story, The Letter, we see how in sort of fairly a simple kind of plot, this woman is due to be up against the courts. It looks like she's mostly going to be fine, except for the fact that there is a letter from this woman, from Leslie, talking about how she, you know, inviting this man to come and meet her. Her husband, Robert, is out at the time. And so Leslie is inviting this man, and this would look incredibly suspicious to anybody who walks by or looks at this, because, you know, here is a married woman inviting a strange man to her house. I mean, he's known to her, but, you know, she's not married to him, on the day of the same day that he ends up being killed by her. She's claiming it's self-defense because he was attempting to assault her, but this letter starts throwing that into disarray. And all of this is the sort of precursor to what Twan then does with the book, and I'm going to go on to talk about that now. So from the starting point of this short story, we get this story from Twan. And what he does here is, I think, really quite interesting given the context of the short story. Now, I read the novel first and then later went back to the short story. And it's interesting seeing which parts Twan has lifted and sort of adapted and changed. So in this book, there is a, you know, in the short story, we have Leslie, who is going to trial. We have Robert, her husband, and we have these other sort of various parts. In House of Doors, we are told the story mostly through Leslie, with her husband Robert, but we also have W. Somerset Maugham as a character lingering in this book. He is this sort of star person. He is there writing his, he's been writing, but he's up against a lot of debt. He is sort of knows that he needs his next set of stories or his next novel to do incredibly well because he needs the money. And so we sort of see these sort of dying days of empire kind of played out in this, that someone like W. Somerset Maugham is this figure who exists in a world where he is very celebrated, but also has this uncertain future in the same way that much of the empire does. But in this book, in House of Doors, we also then get the same trial being the central tenet of the book and the thing that hinges so much of the story. And in this idea of a white woman from the UK being the first person to be the first first white British woman to be on trial in this area, in this country, is something quite interesting for the people around, because there is a certain amount where her whiteness and her Britishness and her wealth and class and power seems to insulate her from some parts of the law and some parts of being held accountable. Equally, the fact that she's the first then being on trial means that there's this really complicated narrative, because actually previously, whereas sort of white British rule and kind of dominion in terms of the empire over locals has been very much from this perspective of sort of the idea of sort of moral superiority, essentially, that okay, yes, the British came over and are saving these locals from things and are being these morally upright people. And then actually, if one of them has gone to trial for having killed somebody, and the perpetrator was also white and British and from sort of an upper class system, and has been somebody who is who kind of equally should be adhering to these rules of moral superiority, it throws the whole thing into conflict. And so we have this at the heart of this book, this idea of this trial going on. And so we start the book leading up to this process, that we are starting to see the scene being set to lead up to what is going to be this big trial, and what that says about the British in Malaysia and the Malay Straits, what that says about empire, what it says about so many other things. But what I think is really interesting is right from the beginning, this story is told through a different lens. So whereas in the Casuarina tree, and particularly in the letter, the story is told sort of watching the sort of the initial stages just before the trial, and this idea of sort of deception and all these other bits. What starts off in this book instead is we're kind of getting this through the perspective of another woman who is watching the whole thing unfold, and she is linked to this pair. She's friends with them, but equally at the same time she is she sits in a very uncomfortable and strange place. She's sort of somehow complicit in the world that's going on, but also not. And so what I think Tan Twan Eng does really well with this book, and again, this sounds like I'm giving lots of spoilers, but we kind of get into these parts fairly quickly in the book, I think, is this sort of establishment of what it looked like to have this sort of British upper class, or this upper class in an empire situation, and what that looks like when that's put to the test in terms of this empire, in terms of this case, sorry. And I think Tan Twan Eng does a really impressive job spinning together these various things, and also riffing on the idea of the Casuarina tree and the letter, to kind of bring it to new heights and new depths. It kind of takes it from W. Somerset Maugham's perspective, and flips it slightly into an extent where we are then being invited to criticize empire and analyze empire through different eyes. And I think that's really quite special in this book. Equally, as I sort of alluded to, W. Somerset Maugham features as a character in this book. And I think that's also an interesting insert of the way that he repurposes the story and sort of imagines almost what Somerset Maugham would have been like within that story. So the idea that, writing something like the Casuarina tree, all 6 stories are based on, in theory, things that W. Somerset Maugham saw or heard about while he was living there. And so by putting him into the story, we're kind of getting an idea of where he might have sat within all of it, and also the kind of problematized elements for him of that. I realise all of this sounds like I've kind of gone into the meat of this book straight away, but I think that's because there's quite a lot that this book is attempting to do right from the jump, and I think it's quite a tricky book in some ways to pin down because of that. Because although it seems like it's telling a fairly standard story from the beginning of this court case, and it feels like it's doing that, I think there's a lot more going on in the background, and particularly because so much of this book is told through a very well-spoken character. Sometimes it's easy for us almost to miss some of the other details, I think, because it's told in this really rich, beautiful language at times, but it's also told through this very upper class sort of dialect on English. And so we get a lot where the book is told in this very fanciful, very long-winded way. But actually at the heart of it, what's going on is something really interesting, because sometimes that is used as a disguise for the bigger machinations of what's going on, either from Twan or from other things within the book. So I think it's doing so much constantly that I think is so fascinating. I'm going to go into spoilers soon, but the thing I suppose I want to leave you with, if you are dropping out now, because you want to come back after the spoilers, after you've read it, is that I think this book is misleading at first. I think it's in many ways a very simple story told exceptionally well, but I think actually at the heart of what this book is doing, it's also playing so many little moving parts. It takes this idea of an initial story and repurposes it. And, I think literary sort of referencing like this is always quite interesting, because, you get things like, for example, Demon Copperhead. You get things like, this is now where I draw a blank and can't think of any other examples apart from Demon Copperhead, but where you get a book that plays with the tropes and ideas from another book and takes them to new heights and to new elements. And actually, I think the experience of reading The House of Doors is improved by having read the original short story. I don't think you have to. It's sort of 50, 60 pages. It's not the longest thing in the world to kind of catch up with if you can. But I think it's interesting to kind of see that the short story, which I thought was okay, I didn't really enjoy that much, in some ways shows what Twan has done in terms of his leaps of imagination to take the central ideas of the short story and blow them up with an entirely different lens. And with that, I'm going to go on to talk a little bit about some of the spoilers. So feel free to log off. Feel free to click away if you need to. But if not, I'm about to talk about some spoilers, and it's been lovely having you here regardless. So take care, if so, and let's go to some spoilers. So with the spoiler curtain upon us, what happens throughout the trial that I was talking about, I think is particularly interesting in this book. So the book starts with this, the lead up to this trial, and isn't it awful, and this poor woman kind of at the heart of it. But as it goes on, we start to kind of realize that things are maybe not as crystal clear, because initially the conversation within the legal case appears to be sort of helpless woman is attacked and does her best in self-defense to protect herself. And then what happens is, this regrettable situation where she kills this evil man who is awful. But as the trial goes on, we start to learn new details that start to really problematize this. We start to realize that maybe the woman who's been attacked has been slightly more aware of things than at first we thought. We also start to realize that this is not adding up, and actually that this has put our central character, Leslie, in such a difficult situation. She is now having to think more deeply about where that puts her relationship with the truth, because if she bails out her friend and doesn't say these things that would otherwise be quite fishy, then what does that leave her with? If she's saying things like, oh yes, of course, well, my friend always wore these very fancy nightgowns, which she did, and so it's not a surprise at all that, if a man came to visit her in the middle of the night, she'd be wearing these very fashionable clothes. But that defense starts to feel weaker and weaker. In the meantime, our main character is also realizing that there is something deeper going on with her husband. Her husband and W. Somerset Maugham, in this book, Willie, have some kind of relationship. And so she is trying to straddle this idea of what it means to realize that your husband might be gay in amongst all of this trial going on. And so she's sort of starting to realize that either way, she and her friend are probably going to end up in quite difficult circumstances. She's probably going to end up either with this relationship that is not satisfying in some capacity, or, you know, blindly overlooking it, you know, to sort of pretending it doesn't exist, or she's going to be in a situation where she is sort of sharing her husband and still maintaining this outward appearance, because she cannot be taken out of this. This would be a massive blow to her position within society, and she's already sort of established in some ways that her role in society partly does rely on the fact that she has this husband who is, you know, a sort of relatively popular and celebrated man. And so this relationship with W. Somerset Maugham, I think, is so interesting because it starts to problematize all of that as well. We then get this reveal towards the end about what's really happening with this court case, where we suddenly realize that the secret that's been held on to all this time has been that the whole thing was planned, that the murder that we were told initially was self-defense was actually something instigated because they wanted to make a certain thing happen. And this starts to open up this wider thing, this wider conversation within the plot around truth and about holding on to secrets. And particularly one of the secrets that's held on to in this book is, you know, secrets kind of exist everywhere within this, right? The relationship between Robert and Willie, the relationship she has with her husband that's at times quite strained, the secret that she's holding on to for years, or that is being held on to for years rather, about what's happened in the court case. All of these things are incredibly complicated, but also give this whole conversation around outward appearance versus the truth, and how actually for much of the British Empire at the time, it was more important to have this outward facing thing, that the British Empire was morally superior and they were physically superior and, you know, in all these other ways superior, whereas the truth was really that so much was going wrong and that this empire could not be held forever and shouldn't be because it's immoral. And so all of these complicated things come together in a really fascinating way. I think that the book really starts probing at what truth is and what it means to be honest, because there's an honesty to yourself, there's an honesty about what you're presenting outwardly to the world, all these various things. I think it's really complicated and interesting in this book. I also thought the sensitivity about the way that Willie and Robert had their relationship was really quite beautiful, actually, at times. There was a real subtlety to the way that Tan Twan Eng manages that, I think, because it never feels like it's been thrown in for no real reason. W. Somerset Maugham, you know, this was sort of a thing known about him, and I like that Tan Twan Eng has taken the imaginative leap of kind of putting Robert and Willie in that situation together, and actually how would that have all played out. One other thing I think I want to say about this book, and that I've not actually otherwise mentioned, is that there is this sort of subplot going on where our main character is really exploring so much of the world and around her. And so much of that involves these really intellectual conversations that she's having, and particularly these relationships. This relationship is often leads to conversations about political figures, particularly Sun Yat-sen. And so there is a wider conversation within this book also around nationalism and around liberation and so many other things. And that's seen as dangerous. She's having these conversations that are all about, she's having these conversations that are around political movements, and that would have been seen as quite dangerous, not only as somebody within the framework of the British Empire and so many other things, but as a woman doing this, that she has these opinions that would otherwise probably have been sort of stamped down a little bit more. So she's this really interesting figure, I think, and I really love the way that we're first presented with her, we have her first presented to us as this incredibly verbose, elaborate kind of person. but there's so much going on behind the show, right? Her language is so elevated, but there's so much going on behind it in terms of the conversations that she's having, the thoughts she's having around various aspects of the world around them and around empire and around all these other things. And that leads to these other beautiful, beautiful moments of text, and just these beautiful descriptions of the ways that she is exploring and thinking about the world, including one of my favorite moments in the book where at one point there are some of the characters, I think, yeah, Willie, if I remember correctly, Willie, Rob and our main character, all in the water together, just enjoying looking up at the night sky and seeing the stars and seeing this, feeling lost in the darkness and the bigness of the world. And it's so beautifully written that I think I was just in love with this description. It reminds me of all the things I loved about Tan Twan Eng's last book, The Garden of Evening Mists, which I just think is one of the most sublime things written. It's just absolutely poetic and stunning. And I urge you to read that. And although House of Doors didn't always get to those same levels for me, I still thought this was an exceptional book in many, many ways. And I entirely see why it made the list. I think it's a very well done book. And whereas some of the other books on the long list might be slightly more formally experimental, or they might approach other things, I think this book is a really quietly complex book. I think on the surface it reads as a fairly straightforward tale, but I think there is so much going on underneath the surface, sort of picking away at these small things that I think is really sublime. So anyway, I've been Bob the Booker talking about this book from the Book of Longlist. I hope you've enjoyed this book. I hope the vague ramblings of what I've been saying here have made sense. And I'd love to hear your thoughts as well about the book. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.